Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. As Pride Month wraps up, I want to talk about socialism and queer liberation. I want to talk about how queer oppression is etched in the heart of capitalism. And by this I mean it's inscribed in capitalist production and reproduction. This episode is based on a really excellent article by my comrade Tatiana. I'll link to that in the show notes, along with some other great articles about socialism and queer liberation. For years, it seemed like there was a lot of progress on LGBTQ rights. Let me put some interesting numbers on this. So, between 1996 and 2022, the percentage of U.S. adults in favor of marriage equality increased by 44 points. It went from 27% to 71%. Among Republicans, that was 55% in 2022, so still a majority of Republicans supported marriage equality by that time. We also, particularly during the 2010s, saw growing support for trans rights. This was perhaps best epitomized by that 2014 Time magazine cover page featuring trans actress Laverne Cox of Orange is the New Black fame with the words, "the transgender tipping point." The idea kind of being like trans rights were the next frontier of civil rights. But now, as I record this, it is 2026, and a few weeks ago I saw a few statistics actually, that I thought were pretty jarring. They were from Gallup, and the report was called U.S. Support for LGBTQ Issues Remains Down from Peak. And here's what they showed. So since 2022, support for marriage equality has decreased by almost 20%. This is primarily driven by Republicans, but I thought it was kind of notable that support among Democrats actually has not increased since 2022. When it comes to opinions about trans rights, or to use Gallup's terminology here, people's view on the, quote, moral acceptability of changing one's gender, unquote, there's been a decline across the board. Republican support is at just 5%, down from 22%, and Democrat support is down to 60%, down from 67% in 2022. So things are kind of, it feels like, going backwards. Then there's a contradiction where, on the one hand, we're seeing LGBTQ people, white LGBTQ people primarily, in the highest rungs of power, both in politics and in the corporate world. In 2022, an openly gay man, Pete Buttigieg, ran for president and then became part of President Biden's cabinet. Sarah McBride, a trans woman, is a congressional representative. Some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world are openly gay, like Tim Cook at Apple, venture capitalist and Palantir co-founder Peter Thiel, OpenAI's Sam Altman, to name just a few. So cisgender, white, and gay. On the other hand, in the same country, we know that most queer people face intense oppression and violence, especially poor people, trans people, people of color. Here I just want to really mention in particular the oppression of trans youth, who in recent years have seen the doors shut to gender-affirming care. In this sense, the rights queer people have won, the privileges of the few people at the top, highlight the misery of the majority of queer people. So, what should we make of this contradiction? Should we think of queer liberation, as a lot of people do, like a ladder of progress, where we just, step by step, we win new rights, we get closer to liberation, and sure, sometimes, like in 2026, we'll take a step back, maybe 2 steps back, but hey, that's just a setback for whatever reason, a blip in current events in the overall arc of history, and we'll just get back on the ladder again. You can probably guess that my answer to this is no. This is not how we should think of queer liberation. And actually, like I mentioned earlier, LGBTQ oppression is inscribed in the capitalist system, particularly, as I'll explain in a moment, in the rigid gender roles required by the nuclear family. Socialism, on the other hand, provides the material basis for ending queer oppression. I want to explain what I mean by this, and I'm going to start with a sort of historical view. Here I am drawing on the excellent and important work of Marxist theorist John D'Amelio. Before capitalism, European societies did, to a certain extent, criminalize certain queer acts. Like many places had laws against sodomy, there were anti-cross-dressing laws, things like that. Because obviously, same-sex desires, gender fluidity, that has always existed in cultures around the world, and so there were taboos in certain places against certain behaviors. At the same time, there wasn't a unified, consolidated, pre-capitalist LGBTQ identity, certainly not a political identity in the way that there is today. But capitalism changed that. Capitalism drew workers out of the family economy and into wage labor. This meant individuals could survive outside the family unit by selling their labor, and this allowed some people to build an autonomous personal life and identity. Urbanization played a key role here too. Capitalism produced cities where queer people could form subcultures, communities, and identities, collective identities, and crucially, people could organize themselves politically on the basis of that identity. In tandem with this, so as capitalism developed, we also saw the formation of the modern family and modern gender roles. These are historical constructions. In a Marxist understanding, the way gender, sexuality, family, and love are constructed and organized is based in large part on human relations of production. What does that mean? That's basically the system that determines how we get the food we eat, how we organize our communities, what we do with the majority of our days, and things like that. Friedrich Engels explains this in his work, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. He argues that private property is central to creating the family unit based on women's subjugation to men. Capitalism basically brought about a new kind of family relationship where the workplace, not the family home or like the family farm, is now the site of production. That's where workers go to labor for a wage. Goods that were once produced in the home, they are now produced elsewhere, and accordingly we go elsewhere to buy them. But the home still has a very special role to play, even if it's no longer the site of production. The home remains a unit of reproduction of the working class, and patriarchy is inscribed in this new arrangement. Men become wage laborers, and even if women are responsible for wage labor, which obviously they always have been, particularly in poorer or more marginalized sectors of society, as I'll get into, women are responsible for unpaid domestic labor and social reproduction. By social reproduction, I mean things like raising children, feeding the family, cleaning and maintaining a home, things like that. This work is not just like a side note to capitalism. This work is absolutely essential for keeping the wheels of capitalism turning. That is a key reason why the capitalist system is enormously invested in gender roles, and particularly in the unpaid childcare and housework that occur within the family sphere. I mean, just imagine how much it would cut into the profits of corporations, the profits of capitalists, if they had to pay for all this unpaid labor, if they actually had to pay for the reproduction of the working class. That is why, although family and gender roles have definitely become more fluid since, for example, the women's liberation movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, the cis heteronormative family model has remained. And here's a really important part. This model is a structure that therefore inherently must repress same-sex desire and gender exploration. Because queer people are a threat to this cis heteronormative family model and structure, right? Queer people demonstrate the fallacy of the biological determinism upon which the very concept of the patriarchal family unit rests. Although this fallacy is already demonstrated by things like women in the workplace, the existence of adoption and IVF, and things like that, LGBTQ people have been especially singled out by the right wing for their role in destroying the traditional family. And on some level, that's true, right? I mean, queer people demonstrate that, for example, people who are assigned female at birth aren't necessarily women. Some people who are assigned male at birth are women. People who are women aren't necessarily attracted to men. They don't necessarily want children. They aren't necessarily nurturing mothers. They're not biologically driven to pick up a vacuum cleaner. These inconvenient facts are why it is so important to capitalism to oppress and marginalize LGBTQ people by claiming that they are not normal. And of course, coming back to some contradictions here, this so-called traditional family model, as we know, is out of reach for the vast majority of the working class, particularly the most marginalized and exploited people in society. For the vast majority of people, there is no private property that can be passed down. Women are usually forced to enter the workforce out of economic necessity, and therefore cannot take on the full-time role of doting wife and homemaker. It goes without saying that this traditional family is also even more elusive for families broken up by things like incarceration, deportation, imperialism, forced immigration due to war and climate change and things like that. And even for people who are able to achieve to a certain extent this traditional family, meaningful relationships between partners, between parents and children, or even between, friends, communities, things like that, these kinds of meaningful relationships suffer a lot due to the alienation we experience due to the nature of work under capitalism. Because the working class has to spend the vast majority of its days and weeks laboring for a wage that is, again, for the majority of the population on the planet, barely enough to comfortably support a family, usually far less than what is required for that. Poor people, undocumented people, many people of color often have the most backbreaking and alienating labor that harms both the body and the mind. There are not enough hours in the day to work, rest, raise children, establish intimate relationships, build connections with ourselves and with other people. I say this because this also shows a really contradictory aspect of the nuclear family. I'm using the word contradiction a lot in this episode, I realize, because as we know, capitalism is full of contradictions. Because the structure here both holds up and is destroyed by capitalism. The traditional family unit buckles under the weight of capitalists' quests for profits. This creates conditions for an ideological offensive, like a pro-family, pro-traditional family ideological offensive. In the United States, we are especially familiar with this, right? We're very familiar with the right wing and Republicans mourning the disintegration of the family, emphasizing traditional gender roles. In fact, as I say this is really on top of mind for me right now because a few weeks ago, I was driving in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and I passed, I kid you not, the actual location, the actual headquarters of the evangelical organization Focus on the Family, I believe founded by James Dobson. So literally they're organizations devoted to upholding the traditional family roles. It also makes me think of, and sorry to go on some tangents here, but hashtag tradwives, the popularity of these hypermasculine manosphere jerks who uphold the traditional family structure and blame social progress for everything, women's rights, queer rights, and things like that. But this ideological pro-family offensive does not even have to be that extreme. or something that we only see on the far right or like the most toxic corners of social media. You also see, for example, politicians regularly admonishing parents for not being more present in children's lives. This was the topic of actually a very highly publicized speech by Barack Obama. During his 2008 actually campaign, he made a speech on Father's Day where he said that the foundation of the family was suffering because black fathers weren't taking responsibility. And I mean, this does not even go into all the ways that politicians, create laws and things like that to try to encourage traditional family structures. So the state basically blames the supposed breakdown of the traditional family on all or for all of society's ills, like crime, gun violence, poor education, poor health outcomes, things like that. Both Democrats and Republicans point the finger at the family while ignoring how capitalist economic conditions have always undermined this very family. And they ignore how the crisis of social reproduction is a direct product of capitalist crisis. I said ignoring just now, but I maybe should have used an even stronger word. I want to emphasize that, of course, this is a deliberate choice from both Democrats, Republicans, from bourgeois politicians, because under capitalism, these politicians are, of course, invested in upholding capitalism and its various institutions. And although I'm using a lot of US-based examples here and using kind of like a US frame of mind, we can't talk about this without discussing also the violent role of imperialism here, because capitalism and colonialism have imposed the traditional family rigid gender and sexual roles in extremely brutal and violent ways. This is not just kind of like an ideological offensive waged on, TV and talk radio, of course. The capitalist mode of production was imposed on indigenous communities across the world. Land was stolen. Colonizers, imperialists used indigenous people as a cheap workforce, enslaved them. The genocidal actions of colonizers included targeting non-binary people. It included the forced conversion of indigenous peoples to Catholicism. It included these abusive boarding schools we've been hearing about in recent years that, among other things, beat normative gender roles into indigenous people. But so, going back to what I said earlier at the start of this episode about the historical construction of queer identity, here is another tension or contradiction. Capitalism created the conditions for queer identity to emerge, while also reinforcing the ideological centrality of the nuclear family, which structurally marginalizes queer people, because queer people are seen as a threat to the patriarchal family unit, to social reproduction, to, in a sense, capitalism itself. But LGBTQ people entering the mainstream has not destroyed the family. The systems of repression of same-sex desire and gender diversity, gender exploration, they are still in place, despite the partial normalization of gay and lesbian identities in particular. This normalization has, to some extent, actually kind of benefited capitalism, since capitalism can profit from this market niche. There are gay cruises, rainbow sneakers, the admittedly shrinking, but the Target Pride collection. Not to mention how, for many years, I feel like the early 2020s were really like the peak of this. Companies benefited from pinkwashing, or this perception that they were queer-friendly companies. They, bedecked their logos in rainbow flags, draped themselves in rainbow banners, at least for 1 month of the year. This normalization has been permitted only to the extent that it does not threaten the underlying cis-heteropatriarchal system. So, as long as the family unit can still serve as a building block of capitalist society, it is acceptable for example, two cisgender men to get married and, say, adopt and raise a baby. The Selective normalization, though, has functioned alongside another phenomenon, which is the domestication of the most transgressive aspects of the LGBTQ movement. Because for those of us who know LGBTQ history, we know that it has not been, this sanitized, domesticated thing where people have just kind of like politely asked for their rights, politely asked for more acceptance. We have, the anti-police uprising at Stonewall, to name just one example, the most notable one. There are also, there have been more overtly sexual elements of the LGBTQ movement, and broadly speaking, just kind of this rejection of heteronormativity among the more radical elements of the queer movement. These are things that have been kind of domesticated and kind of, I guess the volume of them has been turned down significantly. This normalization also came in tandem with the erasure, or like sometimes even literally the demolition, of non-commodified spaces for queer socializing. Public spaces, especially those frequented by mostly queer people of color, trans people, have been policed, gentrified, erased. And even if there has been this selective normalization, even if, Laverne Cox is on the front of Time magazine, Kim Petras wins a Grammy, we know that queer people still face a lot of difficulty in society. They are disproportionately more likely to live in poverty and face poor health outcomes. Gender nonconforming people in particular, but even some gay and lesbian people, are discriminated against on the job or kept from certain jobs. Trans people, especially trans people of color, often serve as an unemployed or underemployed reserve army of labor. In other words, pools of precarious workers that capitalists can tap into. And as we already know, queer people, especially gender nonconforming people, people of color, experience disproportionate levels of abuse and violence. Not complying with rigid and socially imposed gender roles has often meant a social and sometimes physical disciplining of LGBTQ people. It goes without saying that these gender roles, these rigid gender roles and rigid sexual roles, are not conducive to personal exploration, not conducive to personal expression. They are part of a regime of gender and sexual repression for all people, but especially, of course, for queer folks. Although my focus in this episode is on queer people, and so far I've tried to talk you through how oppression is inscribed in the rigid sexual and gender roles required for capitalism and social reproduction, I also want to briefly zoom out for a sec and mention another way that capitalism leads to oppression of various groups. Capitalism is fundamentally an imbalanced, unequal system. It's based on a minority ruling over the majority. In order for this minority to successfully do this, capitalists need to find ways to divide the working class against itself so that we don't question why we continue to work within a system that exploits us. That is a key reason why capitalists try to divide us based on race, gender, sexual orientation, things like that. Like right now, bourgeois politicians, including Democrats, especially those who want to be, tough on the border, are trying to pit U.S. workers against immigrant workers and against our international class siblings. In this sense, capitalism creates conditions where oppression, discrimination, prejudice thrive. Capitalism encourages us to blame people of color, immigrants, queer people, other marginalized communities for our suffering rather than blaming the actual culprit, which is capitalism. So this brings me back to Pete Buttigieg. Just kidding, sort of. Even if some gay men, and I should say some lesbians, looking at you, Ellen DeGeneres, even if some gay and lesbian people can ascend the corporate and political ladder, hopefully I've convinced you today that the marginalization of LGBTQ people is inscribed in the productive and reproductive relations of capitalism. No matter how many laws are passed, the oppression of LGBTQ people cannot be resolved within a system that is fundamentally antagonistic to gender and sexual diversity, that will always fight to break the unity and solidarity between different groups of people in society, like between straight people and LGBTQ people, cis people and trans people. In this context, according to this materialist analysis, what we're seeing right now in terms of the rollbacks of rights for queer people, like those reductions in support for marriage equality and gender transition that I mentioned earlier, these are not just blips in the overall journey toward full queer acceptance under capitalism. They are the result of the system that structurally marginalizes gender and sexual diversity and sees them as a threat. So, what is necessary for queer liberation? It's the destruction of the family as well as the destruction of the capitalist system of alienated production. When socialists talk about the end of the family, including Marx and Engels, we don't mean the end of love or romance. It doesn't mean that you can't have a lifelong partner or partners, or that you can't have children with these partners. It doesn't mean taking children away. I'm not saying that socialists advocate for some weird society where we grow people in pods like in the Matrix or anything like that. No. What we mean is the end of the family as an economic and political unit. Socialism would make sure that no one's survival is dependent on staying in a romantic relationship. It means socializing domestic labor so that one person in the relationship isn't performing unpaid backbreaking work because of the gender they were assigned at birth. It means a society where making someone dinner would be an expression of love and affection rather than a social responsibility. In this sense, what I'm saying here is that under socialism, gender roles would lose their material basis because the need for gender roles, the social need for them, would disappear, leaving open all sorts of possibilities. The possibilities for multiple genders, no genders, fluid genders, and forms of sexuality based on this fluidity. The reorganization of productive labor would also play a role in ending sexual alienation. Like I mentioned earlier, under capitalism, the vast majority of us spend most of our time working, trying to make ends meet. We have very little time for meaningful relationships, pursuing creative goals, having hobbies, things like that. Certainly, there's very little space for exploring our genders and sexuality. But under a socialist planned economy, we could work fewer hours and continue to produce more than enough for everyone, using technology at the service of building a better society, freeing our time and creative potential, which would no longer be stifled by our jobs. Less grueling and alienating work would help us feel more connected to ourselves, our bodies, our minds, our communities. And when we move away from a society where a ruling minority depends on dividing us, we would feel less compelled to turn against and discriminate against one another. In his work titled German Ideology, Marx has this really beautiful quote about communism, allowing for the freedom to dabble. He says, quote, "In communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner. Just as I have a mind without becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic." Putting a spin on this very beautiful quote, my comrade Tatiana put it this way, quote, "Perhaps this freedom will also apply to our genders and sexualities. A butch dyke by day, a drag queen by night, and a dominatrix on the weekend. As the need for gender roles dissipates with the abolition of the family and the socialization of reproductive labor, and as we gain more and more free time, the possibilities for our genders and sexualities, for our gender and sexual liberation, become endless." Unquote. I want to be clear here before I hit the stop record button that I don't want to give the impression that this is like an easy task that we can just dream our way to. Certainly, I hope that you feel inspired, in particular by the very last part of what I said. That quote by Marx is always something that like really warms my heart, really inspires me, really motivates me. But I don't want to imply that because I've talked you through this, left you with like a really beautiful image of like a sexually and gender diverse socialist society, that we are currently, now 30 minutes later, somehow closer to achieving it because, oh, all we need to do is convince people of like how sexy and wonderful this is. No, that is definitely not what I'm implying here. We are not utopian socialists. We have no illusions that capitalists will freely allow us to expropriate them and build a new society and new relations of production and reproduction just because we ask them nicely and persuasively. Liberating love, gender, and sexuality from the confines of the nuclear family. Building a new society based on solidarity. These are things that will require class struggle, independent of capitalists using our own political organization. It'll require using our strategic role as the working class to shut capitalism down in the streets, in our workplaces, uniting across borders, all of these things that we try to emphasize in all of our articles on Left Voice, all of our work in Left Voice, all of the podcast episodes that we release. Because ultimately, as we say, none of us are free until all of us are free. Happy Pride.